Senator Schiff. Thank you so much for coming to our table here at the dinner hour. We appreciate it.
You bet. Good to be with you.
Thank
Senator,
you.
I just want to set the conversation real quick because I know we want to hit a number of pieces with you. I'd like to put up on the screen so the American people will understand exactly what the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 requires of the individual who holds the D&I position. It says, quote, any individual nominated for appointment as Director of National Intelligence shall, not may, shall have extensive national security experience. With all due respect to my buddy Senator Warren, I don't see how Mr. Clayton has any more national security experience than, or expertise than Pulte, than anyone else that Trump has put forward for this very serious work. Senator says he's meeting with Clayton tomorrow. How do you see this? What's your reaction to the comments? Because you know what my concern is? I'm watching Democrats do the old rope-a-dope again. They beat their chest about something Donald Trump says and something Donald Trump wants to do, and they put in the people who actually can get it done. And it makes no sense to me how you can sit there and look at someone like Clayton and go, oh, well, he's less bad than the guy who was just nominated, because that seems to me where they're going.
So, first of all, you're right. The statute requires extensive national security experience, which he doesn't have. He has no experience whatsoever in the intelligence community. Now, they're going to argue that he's been U.S. attorney for a year or so, and he's handled, or the office has handled, cases that involve national security, and therefore he has some experience. He had no experience as a prosecutor, by the way, before he became U.S. attorney of one of the most prestigious U.S. attorney's offices in the country. So is kind of bootstrapping no experience into very little experience. But nevertheless, that's the argument they will make. What concerns me more, frankly, is we saw him audition for this role by echoing the president's conspiracy theories about voting in California. We saw him audition for this role by saying that he thought that the slush fund was a great deal, was a good idea. If he is going to allow himself to become a pawn of the president or echo the president's talking points, even when they're at odds with the facts, then what is he going to do as D&I? Will he be doing the same thing Tulsi Gabbard did by going to Georgia to watch the seizure of ballot boxes? Will he be doing the same thing Tulsi Gabbard did by telling an intelligence agency or council to rewrite its conclusion because it's not compatible with what the president wants to hear? So this is what most concerns me about it. I do think the two stories that you're covering, these two about Clayton and the governor, there is an interconnection here. One of the things that is being reported about Clayton's time as U.S. attorney in New York, or the period leading up to it, is his advising one of the prosecutors in that office not to resign over dismissing the corruption case against the mayor of New York,
Eric Adams.
Eric Adams. And that, to me, that case, that dismissal was the canary in the coal mine of everything, all of the undoing of the Justice Department that was to come.
There's a lot of resignations around that.
Yeah.
So then, Senator, I think we would agree with you that the stories are very much so two sides of the same coin. Jay Clayton, who has been very clear that he's willing to do Donald Trump's bidding. And I would also note, you know, he's a lawyer that came from the Southern District of New York. I believe Todd Blanche was another lawyer that came from the Southern District of New York, right? Folks that said, and people said, oh, Todd Blanche, I've worked with him. He's a real lawyer. And he is, since I would argue, has done more damage than Pam Bondi did. What is your take on what we know at this point about the investigation into the Newsoms? We know what the governor has put out, and then there is some reporting out there. We just had Ankush Khadori on, a former federal prosecutor, who noted that if this were a different time, a different administration, he would have said, like, we need to wait for the facts. You know, there might be some there to this investigation. But even Ankush noted that this is political. Donald Trump is very clear about what he wants. How do you think, not just Californians, but people across the country should look at this investigation?
First, I think you're absolutely right about Blanche. When I met with him before his confirmation hearing, I told him about those folks we knew in common from the Southern District of New York, and that everyone hoped that he'd be the adult in the room. And I asked him, I said, the only thing I want to know is, I don't doubt you have the qualifications to do the job, something that Clayton may not have, but what will you do the first time you're asked to do something immoral, unethical, or illegal? Do you have the wherewithal? Do you have the gravitas, the stature, the spine to say no? And his answer was one I would then hear repeatedly thereafter, which was, I don't think I'll ever be put in that position.
Okay.
But he wants that permanent position now. And this willingness to go after the president's enemies, and Gavin is just the latest on the enemies list, is part of what has just destroyed any semblance of the rule of law in that department. You can't tell me this is a pure coincidence that they decide to go after a Democratic candidate, likely candidate for president, and his family, that this was purely random. The president makes it clear this is deliberate. And I think people are growing numb to this extraordinary abuse of the Justice Department. I spent almost 6 years with the Justice Department. All of this was unthinkable, that the president would be directing prosecutions from the White House. So I think the presumption is now completely flipped from the presumption the public used to have about when somebody was under investigation. Well, there must be something there or they wouldn't do it. Now I think the presumption has to be, particularly when the president is targeting someone, this is bad faith until it's proven otherwise.
In your point about unimaginable at DOJ, I mean, there were times when Barack Obama and Eric Holder wouldn't hang out because they didn't want the appearance to look like they were doing something nefarious. I mean, that's just how much we've changed now. I suppose where these lawyers, who are many of them former Trump's personal attorneys, are carrying out orders. There's so much we could talk about. I wanted to ask you about President Trump's 1-hour birthday call with Vladimir Putin, congratulatory call that he got, an Iran deal that appears to be a surrender and America losing, as Tom Nichols put it from the Bulwark in the Atlantic. But I just want to ask you, because I think people watching at home, you hear these things like DNI and what the role is. Can you tell people that how important this position is in keeping the United States safe from terrorism, from bad actors, some very malicious people that want to do very bad things? This is not a joke. This is a very serious role. The FBI is not a joke. DNI is not a joke. Can you elaborate on that? Because you're someone who's well briefed and well read in, that Americans should be greatly concerned about this.
Absolutely. And let's remember that whole office of DNI was established in the wake of 9/11, when we concluded that the right hand and the left hand were not coordinating with each other, that our intelligence agencies were all siloed and not sharing information. We knew these people wanted to learn how to take off an aircraft but didn't care about how to land it. We learned these other streams of information about al-Qaeda plots. We didn't put two and two together, and with tragic results. So this office was created to assimilate information from throughout these other 17 intelligence agencies. The DNI also is somebody who briefs the president and makes the president aware of threats facing the country. If you have someone with no experience in that role, that has never worked in the intelligence community, overseen the intelligence community, has any intelligence experience whatsoever, like Clayton, they're learning that job on the way. And is this really who you want to be briefing the president when his really prime qualification is as a private securities lawyer? That's not necessarily the best experience for advising the president on national security threats to the country, or making decisions about what resources do we deploy to the CIA or to the NSA, or how do we make sure they're talking to each other but doing it legally, and how do we make sure that they're not using private data, including of Americans, just in a way to violate people's civil liberties.
As a former securities lawyer, I would agree what he said.
But it's so sobering to think about. It's so sobering to think about, because that role is so important, and it'll be hard to sleep tonight after hearing that. Let's hope we stay safe. Senator Adam Schiff, thank you so much for being on the program. We greatly appreciate it.